Here is a fact that sounds almost too ordinary to be dangerous. Every year, in countries all over the world, governments decide what children are taught about the past. They choose which events get covered, how many pages they receive, what language is used to describe them, whose perspective is foregrounded, whose suffering is acknowledged, and whose is minimized or left out entirely. This is called curriculum. It is presented as education. It is, in ways that most people living inside it never quite notice, one of the most consequential political acts a state performs. This is not a controversial observation. It is not a conspiracy theory. Every serious scholar of education and every serious scholar of nationalism will tell you the same thing. The history textbook is a political document. It is not only a political document, it also contains real information, real facts, real attempts to explain the past, but it is a political document. It reflects choices. It reflects power. It reflects what the people currently in charge of the state believe their children should know and believe and feel about the country they were born into and the world around them. Most of the time, in most places, this process hums along quietly. The textbooks get written. The ministry approves them. The teachers use them. And the children learn what they learn. And nobody outside the occasional academic conference room has any strong feelings about it one way or another. History education is, for most people in most moments, a background process, like white noise, present but unremarkable, and then something happens that pulls the background into the foreground. What we're going to talk about in this episode is what happens when the white noise becomes a diplomatic incident. When a paragraph in a 7th grade history textbook, a single paragraph, sometimes a single sentence, sometimes a single word becomes the subject of formal government protests between sovereign nations. And the question of what a country's children learn about a war that ended 80 years ago turns out to be, in the geopolitical architecture of East Asia, something closer to an unresolved crisis than a settled historical question. The countries in question are Japan and Korea, specifically South Korea, though China is deeply involved, and the patterns we'll trace extend far beyond these three nations into the broader question of how any society handles the parts of its own history that are too painful, too incriminating, or too politically expensive to acknowledge clearly. The war in question is the Second World War in the Pacific. More precisely, the long period of Japanese imperial expansion that began in the early 20th century, continued through the occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945, the invasion of China in the 1930s, the conquest of much of Southeast Asia and the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, and the eventual Japanese defeat in August 1945, a defeat that came, for Japanese civilians, in the form of 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That last detail matters enormously to this story, and we'll return to it, because one of the things that makes the Japanese textbook controversy so interesting and so structurally strange is that Japan enters this story as both a perpetrator of enormous violence and a victim of it. The perpetration against Korea, against China, against the populations of conquered territories happened first. Across decades, the victimhood, the firebombing, the atomic bombs, the destruction of Japanese cities, the deaths of millions of Japanese civilians and soldiers came at the end, compressed into a few months of catastrophic military defeat. What you do with that combination, narratively and politically, turns out to be one of the hardest problems in the history of modern memory. And Japan's answer to that problem, or rather, Japan's series of evolving, contested, never fully resolved answers has shaped the politics of East Asia for 8 decades. It has contributed to one of the most durable and structurally significant disagreements between allies that the post-war international order has had to manage, and it has played out with remarkable consistency in the pages of middle school history textbooks. This is the story of a war that ended in 1945 and has been refought in classrooms every 10 years since. Let's start at the beginning. Before we talk about what Japanese textbooks say, we need to establish what they're talking about, or rather, what they're sometimes not talking about, because the textbook controversy only makes sense if you understand, with some precision, and what happened in the period it covers, and the scale of what happened is something that Western audiences, whose historical education tends to cluster around Europe and the Atlantic, often underestimate. Let's do a rapid survey. Not a complete one. This is one episode of a documentary series. It's not a graduate seminar, but enough to give the controversy its proper dimensions. Korea. 1910. 1945. Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910. Following a period of growing Japanese dominance over the Korean peninsula that had been building since Japan's victory over China in 1895 and over Russia in 1905. The annexation treaty was signed under conditions that Korean historians have characterized with good justification as coerced Japanese troops were present in Seoul. The Korean emperor had been reduced to a figurehead, and the ministers who signed the treaty did so under circumstances where refusal was not a realistic option. The colonial period that followed lasted 35 years. What it looked like on the ground varied significantly over time. The early colonial period, under military governance, was characterized by systematic violence against Korean political organization, the suppression of Korean cultural and linguistic identity, forced labor mobilization, and the economic extraction of Korean agricultural production to supply Japan. The later period, particularly from the 1930s onward, intensified in specific ways. Koreans were mobilized for wartime labor on an enormous scale, with estimates of forced laborers ranging from several 100,000 to over 1 million. Korean men were conscripted into the Japanese military, and in one of the more culturally devastating policies, Koreans were required to adopt Japanese names, a policy called Soshi Kaimei, implemented in 1940, which roughly translates to create a family name and change personal name, and which was presented in the administrative language of the colonial government as a privilege and an honor. The Korean language was banned from use in schools. Korean history was replaced in the curriculum with Japanese history, including, in a detail that is rich with irony given the subject of this episode, a Japanese version of Korean history that emphasized the backwardness of Korean civilization and the benefits of Japanese tutelage. Korean children were taught, in their schools, a history designed by the colonial power. This is something to keep in mind as we trace the post-war textbook disputes. And then there were the comfort women. The term comfort woman yanfu in Japanese is one of the most sanitizing euphemisms in the history of military administration. It refers to women, predominantly Korean but also Chinese, Filipinos, Dutch, and others from across the territories under Japanese military control, who were mobilized to provide sexual services to Japanese soldiers. The system was organized by or with the involvement of the Japanese military. Estimates of the number of women involved range widely from 50,000 to 200,000. Ling, with the wide range reflecting the difficulty of documentation, rather than genuine scholarly uncertainty about the general scale. The conditions in which these women lived ranged from the coercive to the grotesque. Many were trafficked through deception, recruited with promises of work in factories or restaurants, and delivered to military brothels. Others were taken by force, The post-war fates of survivors were often marked by shame, stigma, economic devastation, and decades of silence. The silence of women who had been told, by the culture they returned to, that what had happened to them was something to be hidden rather than addressed. The comfort women issue did not begin to receive serious public attention in either Japan or Korea until the late 1980s and early 1990s, nearly 50 years after the events in question. We will return to this timeline and what it means. China, 1,931 1,945. Japan's expansion into China is a separate story from Korea, in that it happened through military conquest rather than formal colonial administration. But it overlaps in crucial ways. Japan seized Manchuria in 1931 through a staged incident. Japanese officers of the Kwantung Army detonated a small bomb on a Japanese-owned railway line near Mukden, blamed the Chinese, and used this as a pretext to invade. The Manchurian Incident. As it became known in Japanese usage note already, the choice of neutral word incident over invasion resulted in the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo, nominally headed by the last Qing Emperor Puyi, actually controlled by the Japanese military. An estimated 10 to 15 million Chinese were conscripted as forced laborers in Manchuria during the period of Japanese occupation. The full-scale war between Japan and China began in July 1937. Following another staged or at minimum opportunistically exploited incident near Beijing, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, known in China as the beginning of the War of Resistance against Japan. 5 months later, in December 1937, Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital of Nanjing. What happened in Nanjing in the weeks following its capture is, in the historiography of the Second World War, among the most documented and simultaneously most disputed atrocities of the 20th century. That combination, heavily documented and heavily disputed, is itself a significant part of this story. So, let's establish what the mainstream historical record shows before we discuss the disputing. Japanese forces killed a very large number of Chinese civilians and surrendered soldiers in Nanjing over a period of roughly 6 weeks. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the post-war War Crimes Tribunal, convened in Tokyo, sometimes called the Tokyo Trials, found that approximately 200,000 people had been killed. Chinese government estimates put the figure higher. Atreisute. Ling. Some scholars argue for lower figures in the range of 40,000 to 100,000. Ling. The range reflects genuine methodological disagreements among historians about what area to include, what time period, how to count surrendered soldiers versus civilians, how to evaluate the available evidence. But the fact of mass killing on a scale that constitutes one of the worst single atrocities of the war is not seriously disputed by mainstream historians working with the available evidence. The events in Nanjing included mass execution of prisoners of war and the killing of civilians, widespread sexual violence, looting, and arson. There were approximately 24 foreign nationals in Nanjing at the time, diplomats, business people, missionaries who established what they called the Nanjing Safety Zone and documented what they witnessed. Their diaries, letters, photographs, and film footage exist. The German diplomat John Ray wrote accounts that were published. The American missionary Minnie Vautrin kept a diary. Film footage was shot by the American John McGee, whose camera produced roughly 4 hours of footage that still exists. The documentation, in other words, is not sparse. What the documentary record of Nanjing looks like in Japanese textbooks, across different decades and different editions, is something we will trace in detail in Chapter 2. But the preview version is, it has been called the Nanjing Massacre, the Nanjing Incident, the Nanjing Affair, and In some editions, it has not been discussed in any substantive way at all. The number of dead has varied wildly between editions. The characterization of responsibility has shifted, and all of these variations are not random noise they track. With remarkable precision, the political climate in Japan at the time each edition was approved. Unit 731. One more thing that children need to be taught about before we discuss whether they were. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, headquartered in a complex outside Harbin, Manchuria, which was then under Japanese occupation. It operated from 1935 to 1945 under the command of General Shiro Ishii. The research it conducted involved the live vivisection of human subjects, primarily Chinese civilians and soldiers, but also some Soviet, Korean, Mongolian, and even Allied prisoners of war. Subjects were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and other pathogens. They were subjected to frostbite experiments. They were tested with biological weapons. They were operated on without anesthetic, for no medical purpose, in order to study the physiology of living bodies. They were killed after experiments concluded to prevent their survival as witnesses. Estimates of the total number killed at Unit 731 and its affiliated facilities range from 3 to over 10. Ling. The phrase affiliated facilities is doing significant work in that sentence. Unit 731 was the main facility, but there were others across Manchuria and China, conducting similar research. Here is a fact about Unit 731 that is essential to understanding why it appears so rarely in Japanese textbooks, and why its appearance there has been so contested. After the war, the United States government granted immunity from prosecution to the officers of Unit 731, including General Ishii himself, in exchange for the research data produced by their experiments. The Soviets had captured some members of Unit 731 and tried them in the Khabarovsk war crimes trial in 1949, convicting 12 Japanese officers. The United States dismissed these convictions as Soviet propaganda and classified the Unit 731 data it received, sharing it with American biological weapons researchers. This arrangement, which was not publicly acknowledged by the U.S. government until the 1990s and was the subject of persistent Japanese government minimization well into the 2000s, meant that the primary architects of one of the most systematic programs of human experimentation in modern history faced no consequences whatsoever for what they had done. Shiro Ishii lived until 1959. He died of throat cancer in Japan. A free man. The victims received nothing. You might think, and this is not an unreasonable expectation, that this combination of documented atrocity and documented impunity would produce a strong institutional imperative in the post-war period to educate Japanese students about what had happened, to tell them clearly that this had occurred, that it was a crime of enormous magnitude, that the people responsible had escaped justice, and that the reasons they escaped justice were themselves a complex story involving Cold War politics and American strategic interests. You would be wrong about that expectation. Unit 731 was not mentioned in Japanese public school textbooks until 1990. The controversy that its first appearance generated, and the subsequent battles over whether and how to describe it, are one of the threads we'll follow through the rest of this episode. The atomic bombs. We must also talk about the atomic bombs. Not at great length. Here they are, not the main subject of this episode, but because they are inseparable from the textbook story. And because the relationship between the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Japanese war crimes described above is one of the most politically and emotionally complex relationships in the entire historiography of the Second World War. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The immediate death toll was approximately 140 price. 000 people in Hiroshima and 70 lived in Nagasaki, with subsequent deaths from radiation raising the totals significantly over the following months and years. The vast majority of those killed were civilians. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki features extremely prominently, in Japanese history education. The dates are national commemorations. The memorials are national monuments. There are dedicated curricula, survivor testimonies, museum visits, annual ceremonies. Japanese children learn in detail and with appropriate emotional gravity about what atomic weapons do to human beings. This is not wrong. It is not a distortion. What the United States did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki was an atrocity by any reasonable standard, and it is entirely appropriate for Japanese children to know about it and to understand its significance. But here, in the relationship between what is extensively taught and what is sporadically, partially, reluctantly taught, is one of the central structural problems of Japanese historical memory and Japanese history education. A society that teaches its children about what was done to it, in great depth, with appropriate grief and appropriate anger, and teaches them about what it did to others sporadically, partially, in language carefully calibrated to minimize moral clarity, is not teaching history. It is teaching a story, a carefully selected, emotionally shaped, politically convenient story about victimhood that exists in carefully managed relationship to the much less convenient story about perpetration. This is the architecture of the textbook problem. Not that the bombings are taught they should be, but that the teaching of the bombings exists in an environment where the context for those bombings, the war of imperial expansion that made them militarily thinkable, the decade of atrocity that preceded them, is handled with a very different degree of clarity, consistency, and willingness to face moral complexity. The bomb is taught. The context of the bomb is negotiated. That negotiation is what this episode is about. What happened after 1945, the structural setup. Japan surrendered on August 15. 1945. The American-led occupation of Japan began immediately and lasted until 1952. During the occupation period, the United States, primarily through the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, oversaw a profound transformation of Japanese political, social, and institutional life. A new constitution was written. Democratic institutions were established. The military was dissolved, replaced by a limited self-defense force. Land reform was implemented, and the education system was comprehensively overhauled. The post-war Japanese education reforms were, initially, oriented toward democratization and the elimination of the militarist and ultranationalist ideological content that had characterized pre-war and wartime Japanese schooling. Pre-war textbooks had been, to put it mildly, not models of critical historical thinking. They had promoted emperor worship, glorified military sacrifice, presented Japan's imperial expansion as a civilizing mission and a liberation of Asian peoples from Western colonialism, and prepared children psychologically for a war in which their deaths would be sacred. The occupation authorities recognized this for what it was and set about dismantling it. New textbooks were written, new curricula developed, new educational principles established. For a brief period in the late 1940s and very early 1950s, Japanese history education was more critically engaged with Japan's wartime past than it would be again for several decades. Then the occupation ended. Then the Cold War settled into its long structure. Then conservative governments returned to power. And then gradually, Incrementally, over the course of years and decades, the pendulum began to swing. Understanding how it swung, and who pushed it, requires understanding a system that is unusual in the world, and central to everything that follows. It requires understanding the textbook screening process. There is a procedure in Japan called Kentei textbook screening. It is administered by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, known by its Japanese acronym MEXT, and previously known, in its earlier institutional forms, as Monbusho. It works like this. Publishers who wish to produce textbooks for use in Japanese public schools must submit their manuscripts to the ministry for review before those textbooks can be approved for classroom use. The ministry convenes panels of specialist scholars, educators, administrators who review the submitted manuscripts and issue ICAN, which translates roughly as opinions or editorial suggestions, but which function, in practice, as conditions of approval. If a publisher wants its textbook to be listed on the official approved list, and being on that list is the only way to get your book into a Japanese public school classroom, it must satisfy the ministry's opinions. The publishers almost always comply. This system has been in place, in various forms, since the early post-war period. It was reformed significantly during the occupation. The pre-war system had involved direct state publication of textbooks, with no private publisher involvement at all, but the screening element was retained and, over the decades following the end of the occupation in 1952, became progressively more consequential. Here is what is important to understand about the Kentei system, and what makes it different from the kind of overt, explicit censorship that is easier to identify and criticize. The ministry does not write the textbooks. The publishers write the textbooks. The ministry reviews them, and the ministry's reviews are conducted with a careful institutional language that avoids any word that sounds like censorship. The ministry does not ban passages. It does not prohibit descriptions. It issues opinions. It raises concerns. It asks whether certain statements are sufficiently clear or appropriately balanced. It suggests that a passage might be misleading to students at this educational level. It wonders whether a particular description might cause unnecessary confusion about a historical event whose scholarly interpretation is still developing. The language of the editorial suggestions is the language of pedagogy, of educational propriety, of academic rigor. It is not the language of political interference, but the effect is the same. When a publisher's manuscript describes the Nanjing massacre and uses the word massacre daiyakusatsu in Japanese, and the ministry issues an opinion suggesting that this word may be one-sided and that a more neutral, average term might be more appropriate, and the publisher changes the word to Jaikin incident in order to get the textbook approved, what has happened is censorship. It happened without a censor. It happened through a suggestion and a compliance. But the result, the removal of a morally charged term that accurately describes what occurred. Its replacement by a neutral administrative word that could describe almost anything is precisely what censorship produces. This is the genius of the Kentei system. If we can call bureaucratic obfuscation genius, it produces censorship's outputs while maintaining plausible deniability about censorship's methods. Nobody banned anything. Nobody ordered anyone to change anything. The publisher made a choice. A free, voluntary, commercially motivated choice. And what the children read in the approved, published textbook is the result of that free, voluntary, commercially motivated choice. The Japanese government has always maintained that the Kentei system is a quality control mechanism, not a political one, that it ensures educational standards, accuracy, and age appropriateness, that it has nothing to do with political pressure. The historical record of what was approved and what was not, examined decade by decade, does not support this characterization. The man who sued the government 3 times, in 1965, a professor of Japanese history at the Tokyo University of Education, named Ienaga Saburo, filed a lawsuit against the Japanese government. This was not, at first glance, a dramatic act. Ienaga was a quiet, scholarly man, a specialist in the history of Japanese thought, with thick glasses and the patient manner of someone who has spent most of his life in archives. He was not a political firebrand. He was not, by temperament, a confrontational person. He was a historian who had written a history textbook, submitted it for approval to the Ministry of Education, and found that the ministry had rejected it, or, more precisely, had issued so many required corrections that the text he had written no longer resembled itself. What the ministry objected to, in Ienaga's textbook, was history. Specifically, the ministry objected to his description of Japanese military aggression in China. It objected to his mention of atrocities committed by Japanese forces. It objected to his use of the word aggression shinryaku to describe Japan's military expansion in Asia. It issued opinions suggesting that Ienaga's textbook was unbalanced, that it presented Japan's actions in a way that was one-sided, that a more appropriate educational framing would give students a more nuanced understanding of historical events. Ienaga made some of the required changes. He made some, but not all. The textbook was approved in a form that had been substantially altered from his original, and then he filed a lawsuit arguing that the ministry's screening process was unconstitutional, a violation of the constitutional prohibition on censorship and of academic freedom. The lawsuit, eventually known as the Ienaga textbook case, would not be fully resolved for 32 years. Ienaga filed a second lawsuit in 1967 and a third in 1984. The cases wound through the Japanese legal system at the speed characteristic of complex constitutional litigation, which is to say, extremely slowly. Ienaga argued consistently that the ministry's editorial interventions went beyond quality control and into political censorship. The government argued consistently that the screening system was a legitimate exercise of educational administration. Over those 32 years, Ienaga won some battles and lost others. Courts found in his favor on some specific challenged passages and against him on others. The litigation produced extensive documentation of what the ministry had required changed in his textbooks and why documentation that gave historians and journalists a detailed, specific, passage-by-passage record of the Kente system's political operations. In 1997, the Japanese Supreme Court issued its final ruling in the third Ienaga case. The court found that the ministry had wrongfully screened 3 specific passages in Ienaga's textbook: a passage describing Japanese soldiers' use of comfort women, a passage describing Unit 731 and its human experiments, and a passage about the Okinawa battle, in which Japanese forces had ordered Okinawan civilians to commit mass suicide rather than surrender. The court ordered the government to pay Ienaga 400,000 yen, roughly $4,000 US dollars in compensation, $4,000, for 32 years of litigation, for the documentation of systematic censorship of historical atrocity, for the legal record of how a democratic government with a constitutional prohibition on censorship had been, quietly and bureaucratically, censoring history. Ienaga accepted the verdict with the same patient, undramatic manner he had brought to 3 decades of court appearances. He noted that the Supreme Court had confirmed the wrongfulness of specific ministry actions, even if it had not found the screening system as a whole to be unconstitutional. He continued teaching. He continued writing. He died in 2002. At the age of 89, he had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 5 times. He never won. The Ministry of Education continued to screen textbooks. 1,982. The incident that wasn't and then was anyway. In the summer of 1982, Japanese newspapers reported something that touched off an international crisis. According to press coverage in late June and early July of that year, the Ministry of Education had required textbook publishers to change the description of Japan's military expansion in China in the 1930s. Specifically, according to the reports, the ministry had required that the word invasion Shinryaku be replaced with the phrase advance into Shinshutsu when describing Japan's military actions in China and Korea. The distinction matters enormously. Invasion is a word with a clear moral valence. It describes an armed force entering another country's territory without that country's consent. For the purpose of conquest or occupation, it is an act of aggression. Advanced into is a directional description. An army advancing into a territory might be liberating it, peacekeeping it, visiting it, or invading it. The phrase itself doesn't specify. It is the military equivalent of describing arson as the application of heat to a structure. The Chinese and Korean governments reacted with immediate and serious diplomatic protest. China's foreign ministry summoned the Japanese ambassador. The South Korean government issued a formal statement of objection. Both governments demanded that Japan revise the offending textbook passages, and then something unusual happened. Japanese journalists began looking more carefully at the specific textbook in question and found that the reported change from invasion to advance into had not, in fact, occurred in the way it had been reported. The original press coverage had been somewhat garbled. The specific linguistic change that had been described was not precisely documented in the textbook being discussed. The government of Prime Minister Zenko Suzuki immediately seized on this finding. The textbook change had been misreported. The international protests were based on a factual error. Nothing improper had happened. Case closed. Except that the investigation that followed by Japanese journalists, by international scholars, by the Korean and Chinese governments who were not inclined to simply accept the Japanese government's self-exoneration, found that while the specific reported change may have been inaccurately described, the underlying reality it pointed to was entirely accurate. Japanese textbooks had been, over the preceding decades, consistently softening the language used to describe Japanese military actions in Asia, not always with this specific substitution, but with a consistent pattern of replacing words that implied aggression with words that implied neutrality or even benevolence. Aggression became advance. Occupation became administration. Forced labor became labor mobilization. Comfort women, already a euphemism of staggering proportion, became, in some versions, barely mentioned at all. The pattern was there. The specific reported change may have been garbled, but the pattern was not invented. What the Japanese government did in response to the 1982 crisis was, in retrospect, one of the more consequential bureaucratic maneuvers in the history of post-war East Asian relations. Rather than defending the textbook screening process or arguing that the documented pattern of linguistic softening was appropriate, the government announced a new guideline for the screening process, the Neighboring Countries Clause. The Neighboring Countries Clause, officially part of the ministry's textbook screening criteria from 1982 onwards, stated that textbooks should give consideration to neighboring countries' perspectives when dealing with modern historical events between Japan and its neighboring Asian countries. Read that slowly. Textbooks should give consideration to neighboring countries' perspectives. Not, textbooks should accurately describe what happened. Not, textbooks should include the documented, historical record of Japanese military conduct. Not, Textbooks should tell students what Japanese soldiers did to Chinese civilians in Nanjing, or what the Japanese colonial administration did to Korean cultural identity, or what Unit 731 did in its facilities outside Harbin. Give consideration to neighboring countries' perspectives. The clause was simultaneously a concession and an evasion. It was a concession because it acknowledged that Japan's neighboring countries had legitimate interests in how Japanese textbooks described shared historical events. It was an evasion because it framed the problem as one of perspective, as if the question of whether to describe the Nanjing killings as a massacre or an incident was a matter of regional viewpoint rather than a matter of historical accuracy. Massacre and incident are not equally valid perspectives on the same event. One is a description supported by the documentary evidence. The other is an administrative euphemism adopted for political reasons. The neighboring countries clause treated the choice between them as a diplomatic question. It was actually a historical question, and the historical evidence was not neutral between them. But the clause gave successive Japanese governments a useful framework for responding to international protests without making substantive changes. We hear your perspective. We will give it consideration, and the textbooks will continue to go through the appropriate screening process. Thank you. This framework has been deployed, with variations, in every subsequent textbook crisis. What the screen has actually changed, a brief and insufficiently celebrated catalog. Let's get specific, because the abstraction of softened language deserves to be made concrete. Across various decades and various editions of various approved textbooks, the Ministry of Education's screening process produced, among many others, the following outcomes. The Nanjing massacre was described as having killed many people without a number in editions where independent historical scholarship had established figures ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. The word massacre was absent. The word killing was absent. Many people covers everything from a traffic accident to a genocide. The forced mobilization of Korean laborers during the war, approximately 670,000 Korean civilians mobilized for work in mines, home factories, and construction sites in Japan, often under conditions that resulted in significant mortality, was described in some textbook editions as labor recruitment, as if people had answered a job advertisement. The comfort women's system was, in multiple textbook editions, across multiple decades, not mentioned at all. In editions where it was mentioned, the descriptions were carefully calibrated to avoid clarity about the coercive nature of the mobilization. Some editions described the women as having accompanied the military. Others noted that various problems had occurred. When, in the early 1990s, Japanese textbooks began including more direct references to the comfort women, a period of relative candor we will discuss shortly. The ministry's screening criteria became progressively more restrictive again through the 2000s and 2010s. And by the mid-2010s, the more direct language had largely disappeared from newly approved editions. Unit 731 was, as noted, absent entirely until 1990. After that year, a small number of textbooks mentioned it. The ministry's screening criteria required that descriptions of Unit 731 be framed carefully, noting that its activities were said to have occurred, or that they were believed to have included human experimentation. This is a fascinating linguistic formulation when applied to events documented in trial records, survivor testimonies, physical evidence, and when the American government eventually declassified them, detailed scientific reports compiled from the experimental data that U.S. military officials had found useful enough to purchase with immunity from prosecution. Said to have occurred. By whom? By the people who did it. By the people they did it to. By the American military officers who evaluated their research. By 3 international tribunals. Said to have occurred is what you write when you're describing a rumor. It is not what you write when you're describing one of the most extensively documented programs of medical atrocity in the history of warfare. But the ministry issued this as an opinion. The publisher complied, and the children read said to have occurred. The 2001 Fusosha controversy. The nationalists get organized. The 1990s were, in comparative terms, a period of unusual candor in Japanese history textbooks, following a series of political developments including the 1993 Kono Statement, in which the Japanese government acknowledged the role of Japanese military authorities in the establishment and management of the comfort women system, and the 1995 Murayama Statement, in which Prime Minister Tomoichi Murayama issued a clear apology for Japanese colonial rule, and wartime aggression textbooks in the late 1990s included more direct and more explicit coverage of wartime atrocities than had been common in earlier decades. The nationalist response to this relative candor was swift, organized, and ultimately very effective. In 1996, a group of conservative intellectuals, academics, and public figures formed an organization called the Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform Atarashi Rekishi Kyokasho wo Tsukurukai, usually shortened to Tsukurukai, meaning roughly the group that makes. Their explicit purpose was to create a new history textbook that would, in their framing, correct the masochistic view of Japanese history that had been promoted by the existing textbooks. They used the word jigyaku shikan, self-tormenting historical view, which in the vocabulary of Japanese nationalist discourse is a term of contempt for any historical perspective that acknowledges Japanese wrongdoing. Their goal was a textbook that presented Japan's modern history in terms they considered more appropriate, emphasizing Japan's achievements, its contributions to Asian independence from Western colonialism, and the legitimate strategic context of its military actions, while minimizing or reframing the violence committed. The textbook they produced, published by Fusosha, was submitted to the Ministry of Education for approval in April 2001. The ministry approved it. The international reaction was extraordinary. The South Korean government withdrew its ambassador from Tokyo. The Chinese government issued a formal protest and demanded 35 specific corrections. The Japanese government agreed to 8. Anti-Japanese protests broke out in multiple Chinese cities. South Korean civil society organizations organized boycotts of Japanese goods. The Korean government suspended planned military exchanges with Japan. Historians from both countries and from many others issued statements detailing the textbook's distortions of the historical record. The Fusosha textbook's treatment of key events was, by the standards of mainstream historical scholarship, not merely inadequate but aggressively revisionist. The Nanjing killings were described in terms that suggested the scale had been greatly exaggerated by Chinese propaganda. The comfort women were not mentioned. Japan's colonial administration of Korea was described in terms that emphasized modernization and development railways, schools, infrastructure, with minimal attention to the coercive political structure that made this development possible and the human costs it imposed on the Korean population. Japan's military expansion into Asia was framed, repeatedly and explicitly, as a liberation from Western colonialism, a framing that the people of Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and elsewhere who lived through the Japanese liberation tended not to share. The Fusosha textbook was adopted by, after all the international controversy, after the diplomatic crises, after the protests and the boycotts, approximately 0.039% of Japanese public schools, less than 1 in 2,000. This number is routinely cited as evidence that the controversy was overblown, that a textbook used by virtually nobody should not be the subject of international incident, and if the only issue were the Fusosha textbook itself, this argument would have some merit. But the Fusosha textbook's significance was never primarily about the number of children who read it. Its significance was twofold. First, the fact that it was approved at all. The Ministry of Education's approval of the Fusosha textbook demonstrated, clearly and publicly, that the screening system would approve revisionist, denial-adjacent historical narratives. That passing the ministry's quality criteria did not require accurate description of documented atrocities. That the Kenti system, whatever its official purposes, would not block a textbook that minimized mass killing and erased sexual slavery from the historical record. Second, the Fusosha textbook's approval established a boundary. It moved the Overton window of acceptable historical framing in Japanese textbooks. After 2001, publishers of more mainstream textbooks that would actually be adopted by significant numbers of schools, understood that the range of acceptable content had expanded in a specific direction, not toward more candor, but away from it. You don't need to get many children to read the revisionist textbook. You just need to make its existence normal enough that the mainstream textbooks feel they need to move toward it to remain competitive. The Abe era, the pendulum at full swing. Between 2006 and 2020, with a brief interruption, Japan was led by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And the direction of Japanese history education changed in ways that were neither subtle nor gradual. Abe was, by his own public characterization, a revisionist on questions of Japanese wartime history. He questioned the Moriyama Statement's characterization of Japanese aggression. He visited Yasukuni Shrine, the memorial that honors Japan's war dead, including 14 Class A war criminals in an official capacity that provoked diplomatic crises with both China and South Korea. He expressed skepticism about the consensus understanding of the comfort women system. He oversaw a significant revision of the textbook screening criteria that, among other things, required textbooks to reflect the government's official position on territorial disputes, including Japan's claim to the Dokdo, Takeshima Islands, currently administered by South Korea. That last point deserves a brief moment of appreciation for its particular quality of audacity. For decades, one of the criticisms of Japanese history education from South Korea and China had been that Japanese textbooks prioritized the Japanese government's political preferences over the historical record. The Abe government's response to this criticism was to require textbooks to explicitly state the Japanese government's position on a territorial dispute, with one of the countries making the criticism. It's not the most obvious way to diffuse a diplomatic crisis over the politicization of textbooks, but it is, in its way, admirably consistent. Under the Abe-era textbook guidelines, for the language used to describe comfort women became progressively more restricted again. New textbooks approved from 2014 onward were required to reflect the government's position on historical controversies, which in practice meant the position of the conservative Liberal Democratic Party governments had been in power for most of the post-war period. References to comfort women, already reduced from the relative candor of the late 1990s, became further hedged, further qualified, further surrounded by careful framing that stopped short of direct acknowledgement of what had occurred. In 2015, Japan and South Korea reached a bilateral agreement on the comfort women issue, in which Japan provided 1 billion yen to a South Korean fund for surviving former comfort women and expressed remorse. The agreement was subsequently contested by South Korean civil society organizations, which objected that it had been negotiated without input from the survivors and did not constitute the formal government apology they had sought. The survivors themselves, elderly women, most of them in their late 80s or 90s, who had waited their entire adult lives for acknowledgement, were divided on whether to accept it. In 2019, Japan's high school geography and history textbooks were comprehensively revised under the new curriculum guidelines. The revisions required every high school to include certain prescribed content, including content about Japan's territorial claims. The textbook moved again. The mechanics of how this works. A brief, darkly instructive guide. Let's step back from the specific events and look at the system from a structural perspective. Because the mechanics deserve examination. The Kente system operates on a roughly 4-year cycle. Textbooks must be resubmitted for approval every 4 years, which means every elementary, middle, and high school textbook in Japan goes through ministry review on a regular schedule. This creates regular pressure points where the political climate can influence content. A government that controls the Ministry of Education, and that has a specific view of how history should be described, does not need to do anything dramatic. It does not need to ban books or arrest historians. It simply needs to ensure that the screening criteria reflect its preferences and wait for the 4-year cycle to turn. Publishers are rational economic actors. They want their textbooks to be approved, because approved textbooks are the only kind that can be sold to schools. They want their textbooks to be adopted, because adopted textbooks generate revenue. A textbook that is consistently at the edge of what the ministry will approve, that repeatedly generates correction requirements, that takes extra cycles to pass through screening, that textbook is a financial liability. Publishers respond to these incentives by calibrating their manuscripts toward the ministry's preferences before submitting, by removing content they anticipate will generate objections, by choosing language they know will not trigger concerns. This means that the ministry's influence on textbook content is significantly larger than the formal record of its interventions would suggest. For every passage that the ministry officially objects to and requires to be changed, there are many more passages that were never written, because the publisher anticipated the objection and didn't write them in the first place. The chilling effect is not visible in the historical record because it never happened in writing. It happened in the mind of the writer who knew what would be approved and calibrated accordingly. This is, incidentally, precisely how censorship achieves its most complete and lasting effects, not by cutting specific passages from a finished work, but by ensuring that the writer never writes them in the first place. There's also a market dynamic that operates somewhat independently of the ministry. Schools choose which approved textbooks to use from the ministry's approved list. Local school boards make these decisions. In areas of Japan where nationalist political sentiment is stronger, school boards have tended to prefer textbooks that align with that sentiment, which in practice means preferring the more conservative textbooks on the approved list. Publishers therefore have an incentive, independent of the ministry's criteria, to produce content that appeals to the more conservative end of the textbook market. The result is a system with multiple, mutually reinforcing incentive structures, all of them pointing in the same direction, away from candor about wartime atrocities, away from clear moral characterization of what occurred, toward the language of neutrality, a nuance, multiple perspectives, and the perpetual scholarly caution that certain things are still being studied and remain the subject of ongoing debate. Some things are still being studied. Unit 731 is not one of them. Its existence and its operations are not subjects of legitimate scholarly debate. The debate, if we insist on calling it that, is between historians and political actors who would prefer that it not be taught. This is not an academic debate. It is a political one, wearing academic language as a costume. The 1982 correction, a postscript that matters. One more thing about the 1982 controversy. Before we close this chapter, after the international protests, after the diplomatic incident, after the neighboring countries clause was added to the screening criteria, the Japanese government issued a statement explaining that it would take the concerns of neighboring countries into account. It also noted, carefully, that Japan had already addressed its wartime responsibility through the treaties and agreements signed in the post-war period, specifically the 1965 Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and South Korea, in which financial compensation had been paid, and through which Japan's position was that the legal issues arising from the colonial period had been completely and finally resolved. Completely and finally resolved is a phrase worth examining. It was the Japanese government's position, maintained from 1965 onward, that the question of Japan's colonial rule of Korea in its legal, diplomatic, and financial dimensions had been settled by treaty. Payments had been made. Agreements had been signed. The file was closed. The comfort women were not discussed in the 1965 treaty negotiations, because the comfort women's system was not publicly known or acknowledged at the time. The forced laborers got a collective payment that the Korean government received, but individual laborers never saw. The victims of Unit 731 received nothing. From anyone. The survivors of the Nanjing massacre received nothing. The families of the dead received nothing. Completely and finally resolved is what you say when you want to be done with something. It is not what the historical record says, and it is not what the children on the other side of the border, in South Korea and in China, were being taught. Which brings us to the next part of the story, the part that doesn't live in Tokyo. On August 14, 1991, a 67-year-old Korean woman named Kim Hak-sun stood in front of a microphone and said something that no one had said publicly before. She said, "I was there. I was one of them. This is what happened to me. My name is Kim Hak-sun, and I am telling you this now because I am still alive and because someone has to say it while there is still someone left to say it." She was not the first comfort woman survivor to be alive in 1991. There were thousands of them women in their 60s, 70s, 80s, living in South Korea, in China, in the Philippines, in the Netherlands, in Indonesia, scattered across the territories that had once been under Japanese military control. They had been alive since 1945. Many of them had been alive since before the war, carrying what had happened to them through decades in which no one asked, in which asking would have been impossible, in which the answer would have been met, not with acknowledgement, but with shame redirected onto the person giving it. They had been alive. They had not been heard. Kim Hak-sun was heard, because she chose to make herself heard. In a specific political moment when the question of comfort women was becoming, for the first time, a matter of Korean civil society attention. Researchers, journalists, and activists, particularly Yoon Jong-ok, a Korean professor who had begun investigating the comfort women's system in the late 1980s, and whose articles in a Korean newspaper in 1990 had been among the first systematic public accounts, had created the conditions in which Kim Hak-sun's testimony could land somewhere. And it landed. Her testimony recorded, transcribed, distributed was the crack in the dam. Within weeks, other survivors came forward. By the end of 1991, dozens of Korean women had testified. Legal complaints were filed in Japanese courts. A support group for survivors was established in Seoul. The Korean government, which had previously treated the comfort women issue with the same preference for quiet non-acknowledgement that had characterized the Japanese government's approach, was suddenly facing public pressure to take a position. In January 1992, a Japanese historian named Yoshiaki Yoshimi published documents he had found in Japan's Defense Agency archives demonstrating direct Japanese military involvement in the recruitment and management of comfort women. The documents undercut the Japanese government's long-standing position that the comfort women system had been operated by private contractors with no military or governmental involvement. Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa was in Seoul when the documents were published. He apologized. It was the first Japanese prime ministerial apology on the comfort women issue. And on January 8, 1992, a small group of Korean women gathered outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul. They held signs. They called for a formal apology. They called for legal acknowledgement of what had happened and legal redress for the survivors. They said they would come back the following Wednesday. They came back, and the Wednesday following that, and the one after that. The Wednesday demonstrations Suyositwi continued every week, without interruption. For decades, the women who stood outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul every Wednesday, in every season, in heat and cold and rain, were not always the same women. The survivors themselves attended when they were able, and as they aged and their health deteriorated, they came less often. But the demonstrations continued regardless, organized by the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance for the Issues of Military Sexual Slavery by Japan, a civil society organization established specifically to support survivors and document their experiences. For over 30 years, every Wednesday, that is a level of commitment that deserves to be recognized as extraordinary, not as politics, as grief. As the particular form of grief that belongs to people who know that what happened to them will be forgotten, minimized, bureaucratically reclassified as resolved, unless someone stands somewhere, every week, and refuses to let it be. The arithmetic of dying. Here is the part of this story that no diplomatic statement can address, and no textbook revision can fix. When Kim Hak-son testified in 1991, she was 67 years old, the youngest comfort women survivors, women who had been mobilized toward the very end of the war. In 1944 or 1945, when they might have been as young as 14 or 15, were in their early 60s by 1991. The oldest survivors were already in their 70s or 80s. They were running out of time before they had even begun to be heard. The Korean government registered 240 comfort women survivors as part of its official support program after 1992. This was never the full count of Korean survivors. Estimates of the total number of Korean women mobilized range from 80,000 to 200,000. But 240 registered names represent 240 women who came forward, who put their names to their testimony, who agreed to be identified in a country where, for decades, the social cost of that identification had included ostracism, divorce, and the lifelong implication that what had happened to them was somehow their fault. 240 names. And then, on the B1, the names began to leave the list. B2023. Fewer than 10 of the registered survivors were still alive. Most were in their 90s. Some were in care facilities, no longer able to speak publicly. A handful still, when their health permitted, attended Wednesday demonstrations. Lee Yong-so, one of the most prominent survivor activists. I continued to testify in forums around the world well into her 90s. Driven by a combination of physical durability and moral fury that no amount of diplomatic language seemed to diminish. But the arithmetic was working against all of them. And everyone knew it. The significance of the last witness dying is something that has been studied with some care in the context of Holocaust memory, a comparison that Japanese and Korean scholars have both made with varying degrees of comfort. Since the 1990s, the death of the last survivor of an atrocity represents a specific and irreversible transformation in the nature of that atrocity's historical existence. Before the last survivor dies, there is living testimony. There are people who can look you in the eye and say, "I was there. This happened. I am telling you the truth, and I am alive, and you cannot simply dismiss me." After the last survivor dies, there is only the archive. And the archive, as this entire episode has been demonstrating, is a place where governments have considerably more leverage than they do over a living human being standing in front of a camera. You can issue editorial opinions about a manuscript. You can require a publisher to change a word. You can insist that an event is said to have occurred. You cannot issue an editorial opinion to a 90-year-old woman who is telling you what happened to her when she was 15. You cannot screen her testimony for balance. You cannot require her to use more neutral language. And so the urgency of the Wednesday demonstrations, the particular quality of insistence that characterized the survivors who attended them, was inseparable from the knowledge that the window was closing. That what was being argued about was not only the content of a textbook, it was whether the living record of these events would be acknowledged before the people who carried that record ceased to be living. The Japanese government's response to this urgency, across the decades of the Wednesday demonstrations, was to treat it primarily as a diplomatic problem. The comfort women issue was, from Tokyo's perspective, a problem to be managed, a source of tension with South Korea that periodically complicated the bilateral relationship and that needed to be diffused when it became too publicly visible. The 1993 Kono Statement, in which Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono acknowledged the Japanese military's role in the comfort women system and expressed apology and remorse, was a significant step. The subsequent establishment of the Asian Women's Fund in 1995, a quasi-governmental organization that collected private donations to distribute to survivors as atonement money, alongside a letter from the Prime Minister, was presented as a further step toward resolution. The survivors, in significant numbers, rejected it. They rejected it for reasons that are not difficult to understand if you allow yourself to think for a moment about what it means to be in their position. They had not asked for private donations. They had not asked for a letter from the Prime Minister accompanying an envelope. They had asked with specificity, repeatedly, over years, for a formal, legal, government apology, acknowledging that the Japanese government bore direct institutional responsibility for what had been done to them, and for compensation paid by the Japanese government as a legal matter rather than as a charitable one. The distinction between a legal apology and a sympathetic gesture is not pedantic. It is the difference between acknowledgement and management. An acknowledgement says, "We did this. It was wrong. We are responsible. This is our accounting." Management says, "We understand you are upset. Here is something that we hope will help you feel better. Let us please move on." The survivors, who had spent 45 years in silence and another 3 decades standing outside an embassy in the January cold, had not done so because they wanted to feel better. They had done so because they wanted the truth acknowledged, formally, legally, in a way that could not be walked back by the next government or reclassified by the next edition of the textbook. They did not get that. They got the Asian Women's Fund, and then the 2015 Japan-Korea Agreement, and then the dissolution of the Reconciliation and Healing Foundation established under that agreement, and then further bilateral friction. And through all of it, the Wednesday demonstrations continued, and the survivors continued to die, and the textbooks continued to be revised on their 4-year cycles. The statue and what it means. In December 2011, a bronze statue was installed on the footpath outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul. It depicts a young girl, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, the age at which many comfort women were first mobilized. She is seated in a chair, resting hands resting on her knees, back straight, looking forward. Beside her is an empty chair. The empty chair is for visitors, and many people sit in it and have their photographs taken, and in doing so perform a small act of witness that the statue seems specifically designed to invite. The statue was created by the artists Kim Seo-kyung and Kim Yoon-sung, commissioned by the Korean Council, and installed over the objections of the Japanese government, which formally protested it as a violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, arguing that a memorial to Japanese wartime crimes placed directly outside the Japanese embassy was not a neutral act. The Japanese government was correct that it was not a neutral act. That was, of course, the point. The Japanese government repeatedly requested the removal of the statue. The Seoul city government declined. Copies of the statue began appearing in other locations in cities across South Korea, in overseas Korean communities, in other countries, eventually including Germany, where a Comfort Women Memorial statue was installed in Berlin in 2020, prompting a formal Japanese diplomatic protest to the German government. The statue has been vandalized. It has been draped in Japanese flags as an act of provocation by nationalist groups. It has been defended, surrounded, protected by volunteers who sit with it through the night when threats are received. It has become, in the 2 decades since its installation, one of the most politically charged pieces of public sculpture in East Asia, a work of art that the Japanese government and Korean ultranationalists have tried to erase, and that an expanding network of people have decided needs to remain visible. The girl in the statue has no name. She is not a specific person, but she is, in the visual language of the memorial, not an abstraction either. She is a specific age, in a specific posture, with a specific expression. She is the age of the girls who were taken. The empty chair beside her is for the last survivors, who are dying, and for the visitors who sit down to say, I am still here. I still know this happened. The Wednesday demonstrations moved to the intersection near the statue, and they continued. Korea's own relationship with its own history, a necessary complication. If this episode were only about Japanese textbook revisionism and Korean victimhood, it would be a simpler story to tell. But it isn't only about that. And being honest about what this episode is actually about, the way nations manage historical memory, the ways in which that management serves current political purposes, and the human cost of the gap between the managed version and the real one requires spending some time on South Korea's own complicated relationship with its own past. South Korea also has textbooks. South Korea also has a Ministry of Education that approves them. And South Korea also has a history of using those textbooks in ways that reflect the political preferences of whoever happens to be in government at the time the curriculum is set, rather than consistently the historical record as the evidence supports it. The most vivid recent example of this is the textbook controversy of 2013 to 2016. During the presidency of Park Geun-hye, Park Chung-hee was the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who ruled South Korea as a military dictator from 1961 to 1979. Park Chung-hee's period in power was characterized by rapid economic development, the economic transformation that made South Korea into the industrial economy it is today, began under his administration, and by systematic political repression, torture of dissidents, suppression of the press, and the particular kind of authoritarian governance that justified itself through development, while eliminating the political freedoms that development was supposed to deliver. Korean history textbooks, by the early 2010s, described Park Chung-hee's rule in terms that reflected this complexity. They acknowledged the economic achievements. They also described the political repression, the military coup, the human rights abuses. This is what an honest historical account requires. The same approach we would want applied to any complex historical figure whose legacy contained both genuine achievement and genuine harm. Park Geun-hye's government did not agree with this approach. In 2013, the administration began a campaign to replace the existing system of multiple ministry-approved textbooks from which schools could choose with a single state-authored textbook that would be mandatory for all public schools. The stated rationale was consistency and quality control. The actual rationale, apparent to anyone who read the political context, was the administration's desire to produce a historical account of the 1960s and 1970s that was more favorable to its founder's father. The proposed state-authored textbook eventually ordered to be implemented by executive decree in 2015, over the objections of historians, educators, civil society organizations, and a significant majority of public opinion was described by Korean historians with some unanimity, as historically distorted in favor of the Park Chung-hee era and the conservative political project associated with it. It minimized the democratic opposition. It softened the characterization of the coup. It described the economic development in terms that reduced the role of the political repression that accompanied it. Sound familiar? It should. The structural logic is identical to the Japanese textbook problem. A government using its control of curriculum standards to shape the historical narrative in ways that serve its current political interests. The specific content differs. The institutional mechanism differs in details. The underlying dynamic political power, choosing which version of the past its children will learn, is the same. The Korean public pushed back vigorously. The 2016 impeachment of Park Geun-hye, which was primarily driven by a separate corruption scandal, resulted in the revocation of the mandatory state textbook decree by the subsequent Moon Jae-in administration. The multiple textbook system was restored. Korean historians declared a modest victory. But the episode is instructive in several ways that complicate the simple narrative of Japanese revisionism versus Korean historical righteousness. South Korea's criticism of Japanese textbooks has been throughout the post-war decades, both entirely legitimate and occasionally deployed, with a consistency that did not always extend to South Korea's own textbook politics. The Korean government protested with full justification when Japanese textbooks minimized the crimes of the colonial period and simultaneously managed its own textbooks in ways that served the political priorities of the governments in power. The problem of history education being subordinated to political needs is not a Japanese problem. It is a human problem. And South Korea has demonstrated that it is as susceptible to it as any other country when the political stakes are high enough. This does not reduce Japan's responsibility for its own textbook record by a single syllable. The scale of Japanese wartime violence against Korea and China, and the scale of Japanese textbook minimization of that violence, is not made less significant by the fact that the Korean government also had a complicated relationship with its own history. These are separate questions, but treating them as separate, acknowledging both honestly, is what serious historical engagement requires. There is also the question of North Korea, which is not a country that can be described as having a troubled relationship with its history textbooks. North Korea does not have a troubled relationship with its history textbooks, because North Korea does not have textbooks that acknowledge the existence of historical trouble. North Korea has textbooks that describe the Kim family dynasty in terms that would make medieval hagiographers blush. This is relevant not because it changes anything about the Japan-South Korea dispute, but because it reminds us that the range of possible relationships between a state and its children's historical education runs from imperfect and contested but functional democracy to an unreachable extreme of complete historical fantasy. And the Japan-Korea dispute, for all its genuine seriousness, is happening somewhere in the complicated middle of that range, not at the extreme end. The comfort women in the Korean curriculum. The Korean approach to the comfort women issue in education has also been worth examining. For decades through the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s, the comfort women issue was not substantively present in South Korean history education either. The reasons for this were complex. The Korean government had signed the 1965 treaty with Japan that received a lump sum payment in exchange for renouncing individual claims arising from the colonial period. Acknowledging the scale of the comfort women system would have raised uncomfortable questions about what had been done with that payment, and whose claims had been resolved by it, and why the women most directly affected had received nothing. There was also a persistent cultural dynamic in which the survivors were themselves seen as carriers of shame, not the perpetrators. Not the system, but the women who had been its victims. This was not unique to Korea. It is a pattern that appears across cultures and across different forms of conflict, related, sexual violence, and it is one of the more durable and damaging mechanisms by which such crimes are kept out of public discourse. The women knew this, which is why they were silent for so long, and why Kim Hak-sun's decision to speak in 1991 was not only personally courageous, but historically transformative. After 1991, after the flood of testimony that followed Kim Hak-sun's, South Korean history education changed significantly. The comfort women system became a standard part of the Korean school curriculum. Survivor testimonies were incorporated into educational materials. The House of Sharing Nanom Uijip, a facility established in 1,992 inches Gyeonggi province outside Seoul, that housed surviving comfort women and preserved their testimonies, became an educational destination for school groups. Students came to meet the grandmothers and hear what they had to say. For as long as the grandmothers were able to say it, this incorporation of survivor testimony into education was, and remains, one of the most significant differences between how South Korea and Japan approached the historical record of comfort women. In Japan, the question of whether to mention the comfort women system at all was the subject of ongoing political controversy and iterative textbook revision. In South Korea, the question was how prominently to feature the testimonies, and how to integrate the ongoing Wednesday demonstrations and the living survivors into the educational experience of young people who were growing up in the same society as those survivors. This difference in approach produced a difference in what young Koreans and young Japanese knew about the comfort women system, a difference that became one of the structural sources of friction in Japan-Korea relations when young people from both countries interacted and discovered that their understanding of this history was, in some cases, almost entirely non-overlapping. The textbook battle in the classroom. What teachers do. There is a dimension of this story that official accounts tend to underplay, because it doesn't lend itself to clean diplomatic narration. Individual teachers in Japan, across the entire post-war period, there have been teachers who taught history in ways that went beyond what the approved textbooks contained. Teachers who brought supplementary materials. Teachers who discussed Unit 731 inches classrooms where the textbook mentioned it in one cautious sentence was said to have occurred carefully attached. Teachers who discussed the comfort women when the textbook avoided the subject. Teachers who asked their students to think about what it meant that certain words had been chosen over other words. And why the Japan Teachers Union Nikioso was, particularly from the 1950s through the 1980s, a significant institutional force that pushed back against Ministry of Education curriculum directives it considered politically distorted. The union had a progressive political orientation, was deeply opposed to the nationalist directions of LDP education policy, and actively encouraged teachers to teach critical history. This produced, throughout those decades, a situation in which what was nominally taught the approved textbook content and what was actually taught in a significant number of classrooms were not identical. The ministry was aware of this and found it deeply objectionable. The ongoing battles over textbook content were in part battles over this gap, attempts to ensure that what the ministry approved was what children actually learned, rather than a floor from which individual teachers could depart in directions the ministry had not sanctioned. Similarly, in South Korea, there have been periods in which teachers, particularly in the context of the broader democratic movement that characterized Korean civil society through the 1980s and into the 1990s, taught history in ways that challenged official narratives, whether about the Japanese colonial period, about the Korean War, or about the post-independence military governments. The teacher, in both countries, is the variable that the textbook system cannot fully control. A textbook is a script. A teacher is a human being. The script can be revised and approved and reapproved on a 4-year cycle. The human being is somewhat less amenable to editorial intervention. This does not mean the textbook doesn't matter, it does. significantly, as an anchor for what gets discussed and how it gets framed, but it means that the textbook battle is not the only battle, and that in counting its casualties and its victories, we should not forget the classrooms where the battle was, quietly, fought differently, the children who have never met a witness. Here is where the time dimension of this chapter becomes most acute. The students sitting in Japanese middle school classrooms in the 2020s were born in the early 2010s. Their grandparents were born in the 1960s or 1970s. Their great-grandparents, if living, would have been alive during the Second World War, but were children at the time. Not combatants or perpetrators or survivors of the specific events this episode has been discussing. There is, in other words, for young Japanese people today, no chain of personal memory that reaches to the events in question. The war is not something anyone they know witnessed. It is not something they heard about from a parent's direct experience. It is, for them, what it is for young people everywhere in relation to events that happened before they were born. It is history. It is the past. It is, in the precise sense of the word, something they were told. What they were told, what version of the past was transmitted to them, is therefore almost entirely a function of the institutional channels through which historical knowledge passes: education, media, public commemoration, family conversation, cultural production, and the most systematic, most standardized, most explicitly managed of those channels is the school curriculum. This is why the textbook battles matter more, not less. As the generation of direct witnesses dies, when the survivors of the comfort women system are all gone, and the survivors of forced labor are all gone, and the survivors of the Nanjing massacre are all gone, when there is no one left who can stand up in a classroom or a conference hall or outside an embassy and say, "I was there." This is what happened. Now look at me. What remains is the written record, and the written record is what the textbook battles are about. For students in South Korea, the transfer of historical knowledge about the colonial period and wartime Japan has been shaped by the presence of surviving witnesses in a way that is now ending. Korean students who went to the house of sharing and met the grandmothers received something that their younger siblings and children will not be able to receive: the specific, irreplaceable knowledge that comes from being in the same room as someone who carries a lived experience of history. That a person who was 15 years old in 1943 existed, looked like a person, was a specific individual with a name and a face and a voice, and that what was done to her was done to a person and not to a category. The death of the last survivor does not mean the history disappears. It means the history changes form. It moves entirely into the domain of the written and the institutional, away from the living and the testimonial. And in that new form, it becomes much more vulnerable to what this episode has been documenting: the careful management of language, the editorial opinion, the 4-year revision cycle, the distinction between massacre and incident, the difference between what was done and what is said to have occurred. This is the argument for why the textbook battles, which can seem to outsiders like diplomatic squabbles over administrative minutiae, are actually something larger than that. They are the argument over what the written record will say when the living record is gone. They are being fought, right now, in the awareness that the outcome will be fixed before very long. Fixed in the sense that the people who could most definitively contest a distorted account will no longer be alive to contest it. The Wednesday demonstrations continued every week because the survivors who founded them knew this. They had been alive since 1945. They had watched the written record be managed and revised and adjudicated and diplomatically resolved and incompletely settled. They knew what happened when the living voice was absent. They had been the living voice's absence themselves for 45 years. And they knew what that absence had produced. a historical narrative in which what happened to them had not happened officially, until they decided to make it happen officially by standing up and saying it, when there is no one left to stand up and say it. The textbook becomes the final word. What Germany did instead, a comparison that is not entirely fair but is necessary anyway. No account of the Japanese textbook controversy would be complete without the Germany comparison. And so we will make it, not because it is a simple comparison, but because it is an illuminating one, even in its unfairness. Germany's approach to its Nazi past in education, public commemoration, and legal structure is, by the standards of the countries examined in this series, something close to exceptional. German public schools teach the Holocaust extensively, and with unusual directness. Holocaust denial is a criminal offense in Germany. German textbooks describe the Nazi period and its crimes with a degree of moral clarity that is significantly greater than what appears in Japanese textbooks discussing the equivalent period of Japanese history. Germany has built memorials. Germany has paid reparations extensive. Continuing, legally structured reparations to Holocaust survivors and their families. Germany's post-war political culture developed across several decades what Germans call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, or more literally overcoming the past, as a recognized national obligation and a recognized component of German democratic identity. Why? Why did Germany do this when Japan did not do the equivalent? The question is not rhetorical, because the answer matters for how we evaluate the comparison. Part of the answer is structural. Germany was occupied by 4 Allied powers, one of which, the Soviet Union, had an intense and immediate interest in denazification as a political project. And the division of Germany meant that the West German state developed in the context of Allied oversight and the political necessity of demonstrating to Western allies and potential Western European partners that Germany had genuinely repudiated its Nazi past. West Germany needed to be accepted back into the community of European nations, and that acceptance was conditioned, at least in part, on the evidence of genuine historical reckoning. Japan was occupied by a single power, the United States, whose primary post-war interest was strategic containment of the Soviet Union in East Asia. The United States needed Japan as an ally, quickly and lastingly. It did not have the same interest in insisting on Japanese historical reckoning that the Allies had in insisting on German historical reckoning. It granted immunity to Unit 731. It kept former Imperial Army officers in advisory roles. It supported conservative political forces in Japan that were not oriented toward the kind of critical self-examination that West German political culture was developing. The atomic bombs, which killed Japanese civilians in enormous numbers, gave the United States its own complicated relationship with the question of World War II atrocity accountability in the Pacific, a relationship that made aggressive insistence on Japanese accountability awkward in ways that were convenient for everyone who preferred not to insist. So, the Germany comparison is not entirely fair. Germany's historical reckoning was partly built by external pressure and circumstances that did not apply to Japan. It is not simply the case that Germany chose virtue and Japan chose denial, but it is also the case that Germany's reckoning, whatever its origins, became embedded in German political culture and German educational practice in ways that have made it progressively more difficult to reverse. The legal prohibition on Holocaust denial, the mandatory curriculum, the memorials, the reparations structure. These are not merely policies. They are, now, features of German national identity. To attack them would be to attack something that most Germans experience as essential to what Germany is. Japan does not have an equivalent architecture. The Kono Statement can be questioned by subsequent governments. The Murayama Statement can be reinterpreted. The Comfort Women Agreement can be contested. The textbook can be revised. There is no equivalent to the German legal structure. that makes certain historical denials criminal. No equivalent to the mandatory curriculum that makes certain historical acknowledgments non-negotiable. No equivalent reparations framework that embeds accountability in economic and legal reality, rather than leaving it in the realm of diplomatic statements that successive governments can walk back. This is not an argument that Japan should copy Germany in every respect. The two situations are different enough that direct institutional transplantation would be neither feasible nor necessarily appropriate. It is an argument that the difference between a culture of historical reckoning and a culture of historical management is not a metaphysical mystery. It is an institutional reality. It is built with laws and curriculum requirements, memorial architecture and reparations, structures, and the repeated, institutionally enforced insistence that the past happened, that it happened as it happened, and that knowing this is part of what it means to be a citizen of this country. Japan has not built that architecture. It has built something else instead. A system that processes historical controversy diplomatically, that issues statements and retracts them, that approves textbooks and revises them, that establishes funds and dissolves them, that acknowledges and then equivocates, that apologizes and then questions whether the apology was correctly worded, that watches the last witnesses die and continues on its 4-year cycle to produce books for the children. The silence that follows. Kim Hak-sun died in 1997. She was 73 years old. She had been, for 6 years, one of the most visible witnesses to one of the most systematically suppressed chapters of the 20th century. In the 6 years between her testimony and her death, she had been interviewed extensively, had testified in Japanese courts, had spoken to Korean parliamentarians, had given interviews to international journalists, and had watched the Japanese government respond to everything she said with a series of statements, clarifications, semi-apologies, reassurances, and modifications that added up to something considerably less than what she had asked for. She had asked, very simply, for her experience to be acknowledged as real, as the responsibility of the Japanese government, and as something that deserved a formal response commensurate with its scale and its character. She did not receive that in the specific and complete form she had asked for, but she had spoken. That was not nothing. In the decades before 1991, and the silence was total. The official record was clean. The textbooks were neutral. The government had apologized for nothing, because nothing requiring apology had, in the official record, occurred after 1991. That was no longer possible. The testimony existed. The documentation existed. The Wednesday demonstrations existed. The statue existed. The silence after the last witness dies will be a different kind of silence from the silence before the first witness spoke. It will be a silence that knows what it is concealing. If it conceals anything, the record is made. Whether it will be preserved in the textbooks, in the curriculum, in the laws and the memorials and the formal acknowledgments is what the battles going on right now are about. Every textbook revision is a negotiation with that silence. Every Wednesday demonstration, continued by the people who remain, is an argument against it. Let's begin with a question that sounds bureaucratic but isn't. Who writes the curriculum? Not in the abstract sense, not society or culture or the accumulated wisdom of the ages. In the specific, institutional, traceable sense, who sits in a room, in a building, and decides that 7th graders in this country will learn this version of this event, described in these words, assigned this many pages, and tested on these facts, and that the alternative version, the one that uses a different word, includes a different detail, assigns moral weight differently, will not appear in the approved textbook and therefore will not appear in the classroom. The answer in most countries, is a small number of people appointed by or accountable to the government in power at the time the curriculum is reviewed. This is worth sitting with. The historical knowledge of an entire generation, the framework within which they will understand their country's place in the world, and their identity as members of a specific national community. Their sense of what their society has done and what has been done to it, this is decided by a small number of people. In a committee room, on a schedule that happens to coincide with the political cycle, not by historians, not by the survivors of the events in question, not by the children who will be taught, by officials, by people who have jobs and bosses and political affiliations and career incentives that do not begin and end with getting the historical record right. We have spent 3 chapters documenting what this looks like in Japan and in Korea. We have traced the specific words that were changed, the specific passages that were removed, the specific arguments that were made for calling a massacre an incident and an invasion an advance. We have followed the survivors of these decisions, the women who stood outside the embassy every Wednesday, the professor who litigated for 32 years, the historians who documented the gap between the archive and the approved text. Now it is time to step back and ask the larger question. Not, what did Japan do? Not, what should Korea have done differently? But, what is actually at stake when a state decides what its children will be taught about the past? What is being decided in those committee rooms? Beyond the administrative question of curriculum standards, and who in a society that considers itself democratic, that considers education a public good, that considers the historical record a matter of common ownership, who actually has the right to make that decision. The 3 things a history curriculum actually teaches. A history curriculum teaches 3 things simultaneously, and it is important to distinguish them because they are not all the same. The first thing it teaches is information, events, dates, namis, the sequence of what happened. This is the part that is usually described as the curriculum, the factual content, the material that will appear on tests, the body of knowledge that a student is expected to have acquired by the end of the course. The second thing it teaches, inseparably from the first, is a framework for evaluating events. Which events were significant, which outcomes were good and which were bad, who were the protagonists and who were the antagonists, which periods deserve extensive treatment and which get a paragraph. This evaluative framework is embedded in every editorial choice. What gets included, what gets excluded, how much space each event receives, what emotional register is used to describe it. You cannot teach facts without simultaneously teaching a way of valuing facts. And the way of valuing facts is always, in some sense, a political choice. The third thing a history curriculum teaches, the thing that is almost never acknowledged explicitly but is, in practice, the most consequential, is a lesson about the relationship between the student and the state, about what kind of citizen this education is designed to produce, about whether the student is being invited to think critically about the past or to internalize a settled narrative, about whether the questions the curriculum raises are genuinely open or rhetorically staged, asked in a form that already contains the expected answer. The Japanese textbook battles, examined from this angle, are not primarily about whether students learned that the Nanjing killings involved 40, 000 dead. Though this question is not trivial, they are primarily about the third lesson, about whether Japanese students are being educated into critical citizenship, the kind that can look at their country's history and see it clearly, including the parts that are painful and incriminating or into managed nationality, the kind that has been given a version of history calibrated to produce specific political orientations and specific emotional relationships with the national past. The Ministry of Education's screening process, in its decades of operation, has consistently pushed in the direction of managed nationality, Not because every official involved was a nationalist ideologue, most weren't, but because the institutional logic of the system, the incentive structures we traced in Chapter 2, consistently rewarded historical framings that reduced friction with the current government's political preferences and consistently penalized historical framings that created discomfort, raised difficult questions, or required students to hold morally complex assessments of their country's past. This is not unique to Japan. It is what educational bureaucracies tend to do when they are given control of historical curriculum without effective independent oversight. The Japanese case is particularly well documented and particularly consequential because of the scale of the violence being managed and the diplomatic fallout that followed. But the structural pattern, government control of curriculum producing government-convenient history, is not a Japanese invention. The organizations behind the textbook, the Kentai system, is a mechanism. Mechanisms don't drive themselves. Someone pushes them, funds them, staffs them, argues for them in committee rooms and in the press. To understand who has been pushing the Japanese textbook system in the directions it has taken since the 1990s, you need to understand an organization called Nippon Kaigi, Japan Conference. Nippon Kaigi was founded in 1997 through the merger of two existing conservative organizations. By the mid-2010s, it had approximately 38,000 members, making it Japan's largest conservative political pressure group. Its membership included a majority of the cabinet ministers in Abe Shinzo's governments, several hundred members of the National Diet, numerous prefectural governors, corporate executives, religious figures, and academic conservatives. Nippon Kaigi's stated goals include the revision of Japan's post-war constitution, specifically the war-renouncing Article 9, which prohibits Japan from maintaining war potential, the promotion of patriotic education, the restoration of reverence for the emperor, and the correction of what the organization describes as the masochistic view of Japanese history promoted by the post-war educational system. That word again, ijakushikan, self-tormenting historical view. In the vocabulary of Japanese political conservatism, this is the term for any historical education that takes seriously the violence committed by Japanese forces in the 20th century. The implication embedded in the word is illuminating, that acknowledging your own country's crimes is a psychological pathology, a form of self-hatred, rather than a commitment to historical honesty. That the appropriate emotional relationship to your national past is pride, and that anything which complicates that pride is a symptom of something wrong with the person experiencing it. Nippon Kaigi did not write the Fusosha textbook, but the organization's members were centrally involved in the Tsukurukai, the group that did. Its political network provided the context in which the textbook could be submitted, approved, publicized, and defended against international criticism. Its presence in the Diet and in successive LDP cabinets provided the political environment in which the Ministry of Education's screening criteria moved, consistently, in the direction Nippon Kaigi preferred. This is how institutional power works in a democracy that has not fully reckoned with its past. You do not need to control the textbook directly. You need to control enough of the political environment that the people who control the textbook understand which way the wind blows and calibrate accordingly. Nippon Kaigi is not a secret organization. It operates publicly, publishes extensively, holds conferences, and has been profiled in major Japanese and international newspapers. Its goals are explicit. Its membership is documented. The connection between its organizational priorities and the direction of Japanese textbook policy during the periods when its members controlled the relevant ministries is traceable in the historical record. This is not a conspiracy. It is democratic politics, the politics of organized advocacy, institutional access, and patient long-term pressure on the mechanisms that shape cultural transmission. It happens to be democratic politics in service of historical revisionism, but the mechanism is entirely ordinary, which means that the corrective mechanism is also, in principle, entirely ordinary. It is also democratic politics, also organized advocacy, also institutional access, also patient long-term pressure. The question is whether the constituencies in Japan and elsewhere, with an interest in honest historical education, have organized themselves with the same effectiveness as the constituencies with an interest in managing it. The answer, over the past 3 decades, has been not quite, not yet, but the contest is ongoing. The role of the United States, an inconvenient structural fact. We cannot tell this story honestly without spending some time on a country that does not appear in the title of this episode. The United States has been, throughout the entire post-war period, a significant structural enabler of Japanese historical revisionism. This is not a comfortable thing to say, particularly in the context of US-Japan alliance relations, which are among the most important bilateral relationships in the contemporary geopolitical architecture. But it is what the historical record shows, and ignoring it, in the interest of diplomatic comfort, would be a form of the same kind of historical management we have been criticizing throughout this episode. Consider the sequence. The United States occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952. During the occupation, the U.S. had direct and comprehensive authority over Japanese education policy. It could have and briefly did establish a framework for history education that required honest engagement with Japanese wartime conduct. It chose not to sustain that framework as the Cold War deepened, and Japanese political conservatism became a preferred partner for U.S. strategic objectives in East Asia. The United States granted immunity to the officers of Unit 731 Inches exchange for their research data, thereby establishing the precedent that Japanese war crimes could be converted into American strategic assets rather than being prosecuted. This not only removed the perpetrators from accountability, it made the United States a participant in the suppression of the public record of their activities. The United States, through the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, structured Japan's post-war reparations obligations in ways that prioritized rapid Japanese economic recovery and Cold War alliance integration over comprehensive accountability to Japan's wartime victims. Korea was not a party to the San Francisco Treaty. China was not a party to it. The treaty was designed by and for U.S. strategic purposes, and its terms reflected those purposes rather than the interests of the people most harmed by Japanese imperialism. Throughout the post-war decades, the United States has consistently, with occasional and partial exceptions, supported Japan's position in Japan-Korea and Japan-China disputes about historical memory. When China and South Korea raised objections to Japanese textbook content, the U.S. response was typically to encourage quiet diplomacy, while publicly emphasizing the importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance. When Japanese government officials visited Yasukuni Shrine, the U.S. response typically expressed disappointment while reaffirming the alliance. When the Abe government revised the interpretation of Japan's war-renouncing constitution, the U.S. publicly welcomed Japan's proactive contribution to peace while declining to engage with the historical revisionism that accompanied it. Why? The answer is not complicated. Japan is the anchor of U.S. strategic posture in East Asia. The U.S.-Japan security alliance is foundational to American power projection in the Pacific. Any serious U.S. pressure on Japan over historical accountability would risk destabilizing this alliance in ways that would have significant strategic costs for American interests. The result is a structural situation in which the primary external power with both the leverage and the stated commitment to democratic values needed to put consistent pressure on Japanese historical revisionism has consistently chosen not to exercise that leverage. This does not exonerate the Japanese government. The choices made in Tokyo are Tokyo's responsibility. but it means that one of the mechanisms that might otherwise have produced more complete accountability, external pressure from a powerful ally that has its own stake in the democratic values it claims to represent, has been systematically absent. This is relevant beyond Japan, because the U.S. position in relation to Japanese historical revisionism is not an anomaly. It is an example of a general pattern in which democratic great powers prioritize strategic relationships over the consistent application of the values they claim to represent. The result, in case after case across the post-war world, is that the values are invoked when doing so is costless or strategically convenient, and set aside when they are not. This creates a predictable gap between the stated principles of the democratic international order and its actual operations, and it is a gap that is visible to and exploited by every government in the world that has its own reasons to resist accountability for its historical conduct. Japan has noticed, over 70 years, that the costs of historical revisionism in the international arena have been consistently lower than the costs of historical honesty in the domestic political arena. This is a rational observation. It has produced rational behavior. It will continue to produce rational behavior until the cost calculation changes. The internet and the new battlefield. Everything we have discussed so far belongs to the 20th century, in the sense that it occurred within institutional structures, schools, ministries, publishing houses, diplomatic channels that existed before the internet, and that the internet has not replaced, but has significantly complicated. The history wars of the 21st century are not fought only in committee rooms and through textbook screening processes. They are fought on social media platforms, on YouTube, in comment section, in the particular and ferocious digital culture of East Asian online spaces where historical disputes between Japan, Korea, and China play out with an intensity, a speed, and a reach that no Ministry of Education directive can fully manage. In Japan, a significant online subculture called neto-yoku internet right-wingers has been, since the early 2000s, a consistent and prolific presence in online discussions of historical issues. The neto-yoku are not an organized movement in any formal sense. They are a loose aggregation of individuals who share certain political and historical perspective skepticism of the comfort women's system's characterization as coerced, denial, or minimization of the Nanjing massacre. Opposition to what they describe as South Korean and Chinese historical warfare against Japan, and who apply those perspectives with remarkable energy and considerable coordination to online discussions, comment section, and social media debates about Japanese history. The political and historical views of the neto-yoku are, in most cases, not supported by the mainstream historical scholarship, but in the context of online discourse, where the distinction between credentialed scholarship and confident assertion is not always immediately apparent. Their prolific presence has had real effects. It has created the impression, particularly among younger Japanese internet users, that the historical questions this episode has been discussing are genuinely contested among reasonable people, that calling the comfort women system coercive is one perspective, that the number of Nanjing dead is still being debated, that the framing of these events in Korean and Chinese educational materials is a form of anti-Japanese propaganda, rather than a response to documented history. This is the epistemological effect of coordinated denial, not necessarily to convince people of a specific revisionist account, but to create sufficient noise around established historical facts that the facts themselves come to seem uncertain, contested, a matter of perspective, rather than a matter of evidence. It is, in digital form, the same operation that the Ministry of Education's screening process performed in institutional form. the replacement of historical clarity with the performance of balance between positions that are not, in evidential terms, equal. In Korea and China, there are equivalent online communities with their own characteristic distortions, hyper-nationalist accounts of Japanese colonial rule and wartime conduct that sometimes extend beyond what the historical record supports, motivated by genuine grievance, but not always disciplined by historical precision. The online battle space of East Asian historical memory is, in short, not occupied only by one side. And the idea that any of these online communities represents history accurately rather than politically is not one that close examination supports. What the internet has done to the textbook battles is to democratize the production of historical narrative in ways that were not anticipated and are not fully manageable. The Ministry of Education approves the textbook. The textbook is used in school. The student goes home and opens a platform and encounters a completely different narrative, confident, emotionally resonant, free from the careful institutional language of official curriculum that directly contradicts what the textbook said. Or, in a different scenario, the student's textbook says something carefully hedged and partial about a wartime event, and the online narrative encountered at home is more extreme in both directions than the textbook's hedged account. The textbook is no longer the primary vehicle through which young people encounter historical narrative. It is one source among many, and not always the most compelling one. The history war has left the ministry building and is being fought right now in media environments that no government fully controls and that no screening process can manage. This is both liberating and alarming, in proportions that are not easy to calculate. The structure of the unresolved, why this doesn't end. One of the questions that anyone who spends time with the Japan-Korea textbook controversy eventually asks is, why hasn't this been resolved? It has been going on, in one form or another, for over 70 years. There have been apologies. There have been bilateral agreements. There have been monetary transfers and formal statements and diplomatic frameworks. Why is the conflict not over? The answer has several layers. The first layer is political. Each Japanese government has had its own calculus about how much historical acknowledgement it can offer without destabilizing its domestic political coalition. And that calculus has consistently produced acknowledgements that stop short of what Korean and Chinese civil society organizations and survivors have asked for. Each Korean government has had its own calculus about how much pressure to apply to Japan on historical issues without destabilizing the bilateral relationship that is essential to Korean security in the context of North Korean threats. The result, in every iteration, has been settlements that were driven by diplomatic convenience rather than the demands of the actual historical record, and that therefore fail to satisfy the people who were closest to those events. Settlements that fail to satisfy the people closest to the events tend not to stay settled. This is not a surprising observation. It is confirmed by the entire history of post-war reconciliation processes across multiple countries and multiple conflicts. Settlements that are made between governments and that leave out the people whose bodies and whose lives were directly affected by the events in question are not settlements at all. They are deferrals. They defer the question until the next political moment, the next government, the next iteration of the same unsatisfied demand. The second layer is structural. The specific legal framework of post-war Japan-Korea relations, established by the 1965 treaty, was designed to close off individual claims in exchange for a lump sum payment. This framework was, from the Korean government's perspective, in 1965, a pragmatic settlement with an economically powerful neighbor that was essential to South Korea's own development trajectory. From the perspective of the comfort women, the forced laborers, and the survivors of other specific wartime abuses who were not consulted and whose specific claims were not addressed. It was a settlement that traded their rights for diplomatic convenience. The legal edifice built on the 1965 framework has been, for Japan, the primary argument that historical accountability has been fully discharged. The legal issues are resolved. The political reality has been, for the survivors and their advocates, that being told your legal claim has been resolved by a treaty you were never consulted about does not feel like resolution of anything. The third layer, and perhaps the deepest one, is that the disagreement is not only, or even primarily, about facts. It is about the moral meaning of the facts. The comfort woman system is not a mystery. The forced labor mobilization is not a mystery. The Nanjing killings are not a mystery. What is contested is not whether these things happened, but what they mean. Who is responsible for them, in a moral and political sense? And what an adequate accounting for them would look like. These are not questions that lend themselves to factual resolution. They are moral and political questions. And moral and political questions do not get resolved by the discovery of new evidence. They get resolved when they get resolved by the evolution of moral and political norms within societies, by the development of a political culture in which acknowledging historical wrongdoing is seen as a sign of strength rather than weakness, as a mark of a mature and self-aware democracy rather than a defeat in a zero-sum historical competition. Japan has not yet developed that political culture comprehensively, though it has elements of it in its civil society, its academic institutions, its journalism. The significant minority of Japanese citizens who have consistently argued for more complete historical reckoning. South Korea has its own relationship with the development of that culture. As we discussed in Chapter 3, China has a government that deploys historical grievance against Japan as a tool of nationalist mobilization while suppressing historical reckoning with the atrocities of its own 20th century. None of these societies has arrived at a stable, honest, institutionally embedded relationship with the full complexity of its own past. They are all, in different ways and to different degrees, still in the middle of that process. And the textbook battles are where that ongoing process becomes most visible because the textbook is where the current state of the society's relationship with its past is inscribed, literally and institutionally, for transmission to the next generation. What justice would actually look like, a specific and unfashionable argument. We have spent most of this chapter describing the problem. It is time to say something about what a genuine accounting would require. Even if what it would require is uncomfortable to specify, genuine historical accountability for the events discussed in this episode would require, at minimum, 4 things. First, an unambiguous, legally formal acknowledgement by the Japanese government of institutional responsibility for the comfort women system, for the forced labor mobilizations, and for the documented atrocities of the wartime period, including Nanjing and the operations of Unit 731. Not a prime ministerial statement that subsequent governments can reinterpret. Not a fund that distributes private donations with a sympathetic letter attached. A forma. Legally binding governmental acknowledgement that these things happened, that they were the acts of the Japanese state and the Japanese military, and that the Japanese state therefore bears direct institutional responsibility for them. This distinction between personal expressions of sympathy and formal institutional acknowledgement is not pedantic. It is the difference between an apology and an accounting. Germany's Anerkennung, formal recognition of responsibility, as a legal and governmental act, with legal and governmental consequences. It cannot be walked back by the next government because it is embedded in law. Japan has not made an equivalent acknowledgement, and the repeated qualification, withdrawal, and reinterpretation of its various statements of remorse have demonstrated exactly why the formal, legal character of such acknowledgement matters. Second, meaningful, individually directed reparations to surviving victims and their families. Not a lump sum paid to the Korean government in 1965. Not an Asian Women's Fund distributed through a quasi-governmental foundation. Direct, legally structured payments to identified individuals, accompanied by formal documentation of what the payments represent. Several thousand former comfort women and forced laborers remained alive into the early 2000s. But now, most are dead. The window for direct reparations to survivors has essentially closed. What remains possible is compensation to their families and to the institutions that documented and preserved their testimonies. Third, a mandatory curriculum requirement enforceable. Stable. Resistant to revision by successive governments that Japanese students learn, in factual detail, about the events covered in this episode, not said to have occurred. Not various problems occurred. Not it is said that some people experienced difficulties. What happened? In the language that accurately describes what happened, with the moral clarity that the historical record supports. Fourth, the removal from the approved textbook list of any textbook that denies or materially minimizes documented atrocities. Not a censorship of political opinion. Political opinion about how to interpret historical events is legitimate. And democratic societies should be capable of tolerating a range of such opinion. But as a basic quality control standard that the Japanese Ministry of Education has conspicuously failed to apply consistently, a textbook that tells students the comfort women system was voluntary, or that the Nanjing killings were fabricated, or that Unit 731's experiments are unverified rumor, is not offering a different historical perspective. It is offering demonstrably false information. The distinction between a contested interpretation and a factual falsehood is important, and a functioning educational system should be capable of making it. These are specific, achievable measures. They are not fantasies. They are the kinds of things that have been done, in various combinations, by various countries in relation to various historical atrocities. They are uncomfortable to specify because they require the Japanese government to do things that significant and organized domestic constituencies do not want it to do. But uncomfortable and impossible are not the same thing. Who decides? The answer we've been building toward. We asked, at the beginning of this chapter, who decides what children are taught about the past? We trace the institutional mechanisms, the committee rooms, the screening criteria, the publishing incentives, the political organizations behind the political organizations. We trace the consequences, the diplomatic crises, the protest demonstrations, the unresolved legal claims of people, now mostly dead. The honest answer to the question is, right now, in most countries, the people who decide what children are taught about the past are the people who have political power over educational institutions. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural fact, and like most structural facts, it is most visible in its most extreme cases. But here is the thing about structural facts. They are not natural laws. They are arrangements made by human beings, in specific historical and political contexts, that can be changed by human beings in other contexts. The structure of educational governance in Japan, the Kentei system, the ministry's role, the relationship between textbook approval and political preference is not a permanent feature of the universe. It is a set of institutional choices made at specific moments in post-war Japanese history that can be revised. The question of who decides is ultimately a question about political will, about whether the constituencies in Japan, historians, educators, civil society organizations, the significant minority of Japanese citizens who have consistently argued for historical honesty, and even the international community that has an interest in a stable East Asia can build enough sustained political pressure to shift the institutional architecture toward one that insulates historical education from political management. This is not inevitable. There is no historical law that says democracies eventually get their history education right. Germany managed it. for reasons we discussed, with substantial external pressure, and, in the context of specific, post-war institutional incentives that no longer apply in the same way. South Africa, after apartheid, developed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a specific institutional mechanism for public historical reckoning. Rwanda has built a specific institutional framework around the memory of the genocide. These are not identical situations, but they demonstrate that institutional frameworks for historical accountability are possible, are built, and can work imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely when there is sufficient political will to build them. The political will in Japan, right now, is insufficient. It is not zero. There are Japanese scholars, journalists, civil society organizations, and citizens who argue consistently for the historical reckoning that Japan's wartime conduct requires. But it is insufficient to overcome the organized, well-funded, politically connected advocacy for managed historical narrative that has been the dominant force in Japanese educational policy for most of the post-war period. The political will in South Korea is sufficient overwhelmingly in the realm of demanding that Japan reckon with its colonial and wartime history, somewhat less consistently in the realm of demanding that South Korea reckon honestly with its own. The political will in China is instrumentalized, deployed selectively, in relation to Japanese historical conduct, as a tool of nationalist mobilization, while being actively suppressed in relation to the historical conduct of the Chinese Communist Party. The political will in the United States is absent not because American citizens are indifferent to historical accountability in the abstract, but because the strategic value of the U.S.-Japan alliance consistently outweighs, in American governmental calculations, the political cost of pressing Japan on historical issues. The result is a stalemate that has lasted nearly 80 years, that has consumed enormous diplomatic energy, that has consistently failed the people closest to the events in question, and that is approaching a point of irreversibility, not because the historical record will change, but because the people who carry that record in their bodies will all be gone. And what remains will be entirely in the domain of the institutional, the textual, the manageable, what we owe the children. There is a specific child who exists right now, somewhere in Japan, who is 7 or 8 years old. In a few years, she will sit in a middle school history classroom and open a textbook and read about the Second World War. What she reads will have been written by a publisher, reviewed by a ministry official, calibrated against the screening criteria of whatever government is in power, revised according to the neighboring country's clause, approved after some number of rounds of editorial opinions, printed, and placed in her hands by a teacher who may or may not add context that the textbook doesn't provide. What she reads will not be a lie. Exactly. Outright fabrication is rare in approved Japanese textbooks. What she reads will be something more insidious than a lie, a carefully managed selection of truths, arranged and worded to produce a specific relationship between her and her national past, a relationship in which Japan was a country that fought a war, made mistakes, suffered greatly, was defeated, and has since become a peaceful, prosperous democracy, a relationship in which the children who had their names taken away, the women who were mobilized to comfort soldiers, the people who died in medical experiments in Harbin, the hundreds of thousands of bodies in Nanjing are present, if at all, as background facts rather than as the moral weight of a history that demands to be faced. This specific child deserves better than that, not because knowing about atrocity is pleasant. It isn't. Not because historical guilt is an appropriate thing to impose on children. It isn't guilt for events that happened before you were born. It is not a useful emotional response. And the goal of honest historical education is not to produce guilty Japanese children. The goal is to produce informed ones, citizens who can look at their country's history and understand it accurately, the achievements and the violence, the periods of remarkable cultural and economic development, and the decades of imperial brutality, the genuine tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the genuine tragedy of what Japan did to the people of Korea and China and Southeast Asia before those bombs fell, and who can hold all of it as adults, without needing to be protected from the complexity. The management of history is, at its core, a decision not to trust children with the truth. It is a decision that children cannot be expected to handle moral complexity, that they need a simplified and flattering version of their national story to develop appropriate patriotic attachment, that the full record is too dangerous or too destabilizing to put in front of young people. This is, in various forms, the argument that educational bureaucracies everywhere make when they manage historical content for political purposes. It is a condescending argument. It underestimates children, and it underestimates the resilience of democratic societies when their citizens are genuinely informed rather than strategically educated. Children who are taught accurate, complete, morally serious history do not become self-hating nihilists who are incapable of loving their country. They become adults who love their country clearly, who can distinguish between what is admirable in their national tradition and what is not, who can hold a critical perspective alongside an emotional attachment, who are harder to manipulate with appeals to historical grievance because they understand the history too well to accept a simplified narrative of victimhood and righteousness. The children who are taught a managed version of history become something else. They become adults who encounter, at some point in their lives, through a foreign film, through a conversation with someone from another country, through the internet, through the testimony of a survivor, they were not supposed to hear a version of the past that contradicts the version they were given. And they have to make a choice. In that moment, between the managed version and the fuller one, between the story they were given and the story the evidence supports, that choice is much harder and much more destabilizing when it comes as a shock rather than as a development of something they were already taught to engage with. The managed version does not protect children from historical complexity. It just ensures that when the complexity arrives, it arrives without preparation. The specific child in the Japanese middle school classroom in a few years' time deserves a history education that prepares her for that complexity. She deserves to be told, clearly and with appropriate context, what the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army did in Nanjing, what happened to the women who were mobilized as comfort women, what occurred in the facilities of Unit 731, not to destroy her sense of her own country, but to give her the kind of citizenship that can actually grapple with what a country is, what it has done, and what it owes not to her, but to the people it harmed. This is what we owe the children, not a comfortable story, the truth, the textbook that moves every 10 years, a final accounting. The title of this episode describes something real, every decade or so. In the broad rhythm of Japanese educational politics and East Asian diplomatic relations, a textbook controversy erupts. A specific published text, or a specific screening decision, or a specific curriculum change becomes the focal point for all the accumulated tension between Japan and its neighbors about historical memory. The controversy generates headlines, diplomatic protests, formal statements, television coverage. There are demonstrations. There are summits. There are agreements, partially implemented. There are words, exchanged apologies, clarification, objection, reassurances, and then the controversy fades. The diplomatic crisis is managed. The textbook revision that provoked it remains. or is slightly modified, or is gradually phased out as the 4-year cycle turns. New textbooks are approved. The next generation of students opens them. And somewhere, 10 years later, more or less, there is another controversy about a different textbook, or a different screening decision, or a different curriculum change, but about the same fundamental question. Who decides what the children remember? This cycle will continue not because the people involved are bad, not because no one is trying to resolve it, but because the underlying question has not been settled in the way it needs to be settled, institutionally, legally, irreversibly. The cycle continues because what has been built, on all sides, is a system for managing the question rather than answering it. And managed questions do not resolve. They recur. They recur because the people who were harmed were real, because what was done to them was documented, because the gap between the documentation and the textbook is measurable and has been measured repeatedly by people who devoted professional lifetimes to measuring it, because that gap has had consequences for actual human lives in the specific, named, individual form of women who stood outside an embassy in January cold for 30 years, and in the larger, statistical form of diplomatic friction that has complicated the security architecture of a region where nuclear-armed states are in regular proximity. The gap has consequences, and the gap is a choice, not a natural feature of the landscape. A choice, made in committee rooms, refreshed every 4 years, maintained by political organizations, enabled by strategic alliances, and delivered in the form of a book to a child sitting in a classroom, looking forward. The child is still looking forward. The question is what they will see.